Hey guys, welcome to the Read Aloud for June 10th. Let's see where we were. We could not detect either of these things ourselves. That is, we didn't feel any different, and since we had no contact with the other groups, we had no basis for comparison. All we had to go by was what Dr. Schultz said. He and the others were preparing a research paper about us to be published in some scientific journal. So each morning he dictated the results on the previous day's test into a tape recorder. We heard all of it, though there was a lot of technical stuff we couldn't understand, especially at first. Until the paper was published, he kept reminding George and Julia of this. The whole experiment was to be kept secret. The one important phase of training began one day after weeks of really hard work at the shape recognition that I mentioned before. But this was different. For the first time, they used sounds along with the shapes and pictures, real pictures we could recognize. For example, one of the first and simplest of these exercises was a picture, a clear photograph of a rat. I suppose they felt sure we would know what that was. This picture was shown on a screen with a light behind it. Then after I had looked at the picture and recognized it, a shape flashed on the screen under it, a sort of half circle in two straight lines, not like anything I had ever seen before. Then the voice began, R, R, R. It was Julia's voice speaking very clearly, but it had a tiny sound. It was a record. After repeating R a dozen times or so, that particular shape disappeared and another one came on the screen, still under the picture of the rat. It was a triangle with legs on it, and Julia's voice began, aye, aye, aye. When that shape disappeared, a third one came on the screen. This one was a cross. Julia's voice said T, T, T. Then all three shapes appeared at once, and the record said R-I-E-T, rat. R-A-T, rat. You will already recognize what was going on. They were teaching us to read. The symbols under the picture were the letters R-A-T, but the idea did not become clear to me, nor to any of us for quite some time, because of course we didn't know what reading was. Oh, we learned to recognize the shapes easily enough, and when I saw the rat picture, I knew straight away what symbols would appear beneath it. In the same way, when the picture showed a cat, I knew the same shapes would appear, except the first one would be a half circle, and Julia's voice would repeat, C, C, C. I even learned when the photograph showed not one, but several rats, a fourth shape would appear under it, a snaky line, and the sound for that one was S, S, S. But as to what all this was for, none of us had any inkling. It was Jenner who finally figured it out. By this time, we had developed a sort of system of communication. A simple enough thing, just passing spoken messages from one cage to the next, like passing notes in school. Justin, who was still next to me, called to me one day, "Message for Nicodemus from Jenner," he says, "important." "All right," I said, "what's the message?" "Look at the shapes on the wall next to the door," he said, to look carefully. My cage, like Jenner's and those of the rest of A group, were close enough to the door so I could see what it meant. Near the doorway, there was a large square piece of white cardboard fastened to the wall, a sign. It was covered with an assortment of black markings to which I had never paid any attention, though they had been there ever since we arrived. Now, for the first time, I looked at them carefully and I grasped what Jenner had discovered. The top line of black marks on the wall were instantly familiar. Rats, R-A-T-S. As soon as I saw them, I thought of the picture that went with them, and as soon as I did that, I was, for the first time, reading. Because of course, that's what reading is, using symbols to suggest a picture or idea. From that time on, it gradually became clear to me what all these lessons were for, and once I understood the idea, I was eager to learn more. I could scarcely wait for the next lesson and the next. The whole concept of reading, to me at least, was fascinating. I remember how proud I was months later. I was able to read and understand the whole sign. I read it hundreds of times, and I'll never forget it. Rats may not be removed from the laboratory without written permission. And at the bottom, in similar letters, was the words NIM. But then a puzzling thing came up, and a thing we're still not sure about even now. Apparently, Dr. Schultz, who was running the lessons, did not realize how well they were succeeding. He continued the training with new words and pictures every day, but the fact is, once we grasped the idea and learned the different sounds each letter stood for, we leaped way ahead of him. I remember well during one of our lessons looking at the picture of a tree. Under it, the letters flashed TREE. But in the photograph, though the tree was in the foreground, there was a building in the background and a sign near it. I scarcely glanced at tree, but concentrated instead on reading the sign. It said, NIM private parking by permit only, reserved for doctors and staff, no visitor parking. The building behind it, tall and white, looked very much like the building we were in. I'm sure Dr. Schultz had plans for testing our reading ability. I could even guess from the words he was teaching us what the tests were going to be like. For example, he taught us left, right, door, food, open, and so on. It was not hard to imagine the test. I would be placed in one chamber, my food in another, and there would be two doors, a sign saying for food, open door at right, or something like that. Then, if all of us moved unerringly toward the proper door, he would know we understood the sign. As I said, I'm sure he planned to do this, but apparently he did not think we were ready for it yet. I think maybe he was even a little afraid to try it, because if he did it too soon, or if for any other reason it did not work, his experiment would be a failure. He wanted to be sure, and his caution was his undoing. Justin announced one evening around the partition, I'm going to get out of my cage tonight and wander around a bit. How can you? It's locked. Yes, but did you notice along the bottom edge there's a printed strip? I had noticed it. I should perhaps explain that when Dr. Schultz and the others opened our cages, we could never quite see how they did it. They manipulated something under the plastic floor, something we couldn't see. What does it say? I've been trying to read it the last 3 times they brought me back from training. It's very small print, but I think I finally made it out. It says, to release door, pull knob forward and slide right. Knob. Under the floor, about an inch back, there's a metal thing just in front of the shelf. I think that's the knob. I think I can reach it through the wire. Anyway, I'm going to try. Now? Not until they close up. Closing up was a ritual Dr. Schultz, George, and Julia went through each night. For about an hour, they sat at their desks, wrote notes in books, filed papers in cabinets, and finally locked the cabinets. Then they checked all the cages, dimmed the lights, locked the doors, and went home, leaving us alone in the still laboratory. About half an hour after they left that night, Justin said, I'm going to try now. I heard a scuffling noise, a click, a scrape of metal, and in a matter of seconds, I saw his door swing open. It was as simple as that, when you could read. Wait, I said. What's the matter? If you jump down, you won't be able to get back in. They'll know. I thought of that. I'm not going to jump down. I'm going to climb up the outside of the cage. It's easy. I've climbed up the inside 1,000 times. Above these cages, there's another shelf, and it's empty. I'm going to walk along there and see what I can see. I think there's a way to climb to the floor and up again. Why don't I go with you? My door would open the same way as his. Better not this time, don't you think? If something goes wrong and I can't get back, they'll say, it's just A9 again. But if 2 of us are found outside, they'll take it seriously. They might put new locks on the cages. He was right, and you can see that already we both had the same idea in mind, that this might be the first step towards escape for us all. The air ducts. And so it was. By teaching us how to read, they had taught us how to get away. Justin climbed easily up the open door of his cage and vanished over the top with a flick of his tail. He came back an hour later, greatly excited and full of information. Yet it was typical of Justin that even excited as he was, he stayed calm. He thought clearly, climbed down the front of my cage rather than his, and spoke softly. We both assumed that by now the other rats were asleep. Nicodemus, come on out, I'll show you how. He directed me as I reached through the wire bars and the door and felt beneath it. I found the small metal knob, slid it forward and sideways, and felt the door swing loose against my shoulder. I followed him up the side of the cage to the shelf above, and there we stopped. It was the first time I had met Justin face to face. He said, it's better talking here than around the partition. Yes, did you get down? Yes. How did you get back up? At the end of this shelf, there's a big cabinet. They keep the mouse cages in it. It has wire mesh doors. You can climb up and down them like a ladder. Of course, I said. I remember now. I had seen the cabinet many times when my cage was carried past it. For some reason, perhaps because they were smaller, the mice were kept in the cages within a cage. Just then, Justin said, "Nicodemus, I think I found a way to get out." "You have? How?" "How? At each end of the room, there's an opening in the baseboard at the bottom of the wall. Air blows in through one of them and out the other. Each one has a metal grid covering it, and on the grid there's a sign that says, 'Lift to adjust airflow.' I lifted one of them. It hangs on hinges like a trap door. Behind it, there's a thing like a metal window. When you slide it open, more air blows in. But the main thing is, it's easily big enough to walk through and get out." "But what's on the other side? Where does it lead?" "Well, on the other side, there's a duct, a thing like a square metal pipe built right into the wall. I walked along it, not very far, but I can figure out where it must go. There's bound to be a duct like it leading to every room in the building, and they must all branch off one main central pipe, and that one has to lead somewhere to the outside, because that's where our air comes from. That's why they never open the windows. I don't think those windows can open." He was right, of course. The building had central air conditioning, and what we had to do was find the main air shaft and explore it. There would have to be an intake at one end and an outlet at the other, but that was easier said than done. And before it was done, there were questions to be answered. What about the rest of the rats? There were 20 of us in the laboratory, and we had to let the others know. So one by one, we woke them and showed them how to open the cages. It was an odd assembly that gathered that night under the dim lights in the echoing laboratory. On the shelf where Justin and I had talked, we all knew each other in a way, from the passing of messages over the preceding months. And except for Jenner and me, none of us had ever really met. We were strangers. Though, as you can imagine, it did not take long for us to develop a feeling of camaraderie, for we 20 were alone in a strange world. We'll read more tomorrow.